Edward Kavanagh is the chief executive of the McKell Institute. He foreshadowed the need for government intervention ahead of Whyalla's collapse into administration and joins me now. Edward, always good to chat. Now, just take me into this whole situation right now, because it really is a case where the federal government, the South Australian government, inevitably are going to have to put money in here to make this thing a viable option for these companies.
Well, look, let's just see what comes of the next process. We've seen an expression of interest close last week. You know, this is a remarkable state of affairs that we have some of the biggest steel companies in the world coming into the South Australian market and expressing interest. So this is a really positive step. If we wind back, 6 months ago where the Steelworks was, we were in this period where effectively the last private owner had been kind of letting it drive into the ground, which was really unsustainable. So it was a really big risk by the government to intervene earlier in the year. I think the fact that we have the likes of BlueScope putting their hand up and saying there is a future here is really, really positive. So we'll have to wait and see the degree to which the South Australian federal governments have to, dip in even further and invest further. But so far, this is a really encouraging sign for Whyalla, but also just for the approach that these governments have taken.
OK, so BlueScope today says this is still going to achieve its own hurdle rate for return on investment. It's going to need a deal with unions, a deal with governments to try and achieve that. But then what you point out is for the government and for Australians all, this is of strategic importance. Australia needs a viable Whyalla in terms of our own sustainability.
This is exactly right. We have only a couple of steel makers or steel plants in Australia. Whyalla is one of them. The reason why the government was so determined earlier in the year to prop this up and to make this intervention was that there was a real risk that the Whyalla plant itself actually degraded to a point where it was no longer viable. And that would have been a loss not only for the community of Whyalla, for the South Australian economy, but for the capacity of Australia's economy to actually produce structural steel. And we look at all of the trade coercion, all of the complexity that's happening in the region. The last thing that the Australian people need is one of the most critical sovereign industrial assets going into decay at the hands of an irresponsible owner. So, there is a big opportunity here for private investors, but there also is, an obligation for the governments to make sure that this deal works and that it works for the people of Whyalla and the sovereign industrial capacity of Australia more broadly.
And it's also got a source of iron ore, which is close by, which is a very rare treasure in terms of the quality of the iron ore that's in that deposit. And that's a key to keep it going. But then there's another thing also, the aspiration for green steel or green iron. Is that real? Because as we all know, it's not economically viable at this stage. And if it is going to be made, most likely in China at much larger volumes, is there a place for Whyalla to try and enter that market?
I think in the long term, there certainly is a place for that. South Australia is abundant in energy sources, abundant in renewable energy sources. You're right, there's the mine, there's the Whyalla plant, there's the Gulf right there. Every ingredient you could possibly hope for that green steel future is in South Australia. But the fact is we can't get to a green steel future if we lose the Whyalla plant in the first place. You're not going to be able to recreate that out of thin air. So the most important thing initially is preserving what is there, recapitalising the plant so it's actually sustainable, and making sure that the skills as well in Whyalla aren't lost. If we lose all of those, then there's certainly no hope for a green steel future, let alone any steel future.
But just to be short here, the fact is that this consortium, you believe, is a positive sign for government, a positive sign for South Australia?
I think it's a vote of confidence in both the state, but also in the plant and the strategic value of it and those assets that you talked about, the abundance of energy, the fact that the mines are right nearby. This is a highly unique asset, and that's why it's attracting some of the biggest steel makers in the world.
I'll tell you what, Edward Kavanagh, always good to chat to you. Many thanks for your time.